Okay. Okay. So, I mean, the inspiration behind this tasting was really from being on quite a few Facebook groups internationally that have a lot of US beer drinkers, and they raved about Athletic Brewing. And I think it's something that I had been fortunate enough to taste, but most in the UK hadn't. They hadn't come over here formally, and there's a load of hype because of that. I think Athletic have pretty much dominated the US non-alcoholic beer scene. They've produced some amazing beers. And actually, the hype is so much that they release special beers from time to time, and they sell out within half an hour. So they put them on the site, half an hour, gone. It's that popular, and there's that much hype. So they have a capacity problem in brewing, not a demand problem. And so you get a lot of the guys on those sites going, "Oh, this is the best in the world and the best in the world." But if you listen to Bill Schufelt, who is the CEO and founder of Athletic, the journey for them to start this brewery began in Europe. They toured Europe. They went to some of these breweries, particularly Germany. And the inspiration for their beer, they took that back and then decided, right, how can we improve on this? And actually, I know, a lot of there's loads of great breweries, and I think it's a more mature market over here. And some of the beers we've got tonight have been, influenced by Germany and other countries. And so I just thought it would be a really good thing to do a side-by-side taste test, get beyond the hype and understand how do Europe compare to the US. And what I've tried to do is get some similar beers in profile. Obviously, there are less of them than the full strength world, so you can't get a perfect fit. I'm sure Nat will say, actually, these are quite different with a professional. So please be honest about that, Nat. But I've tried to get what I think are, closest for a close comparison rather than the best beers that are available. So yeah, that's it. We're going to do a little bit on, Nat's going to tell us how to taste the beer, and then we'll do two sections, one of the sort of lighter color beers and one of the darker color beers, and we'll have a glass refresh and comfort break in the middle. So without further ado, Nat, please tell us how to taste beer.
Perfect. So yes, I'm actually going to start even before how to taste. We're first going to talk about what we're tasting for, but I don't want to make anyone wait for beer. Come on. So go ahead and get your first beer if you would like to. We're going to start with the Upside Dawn from Athletic. So do feel free to just pour a little bit of that into your glass, and I will show you the perfect pour. Then we'll talk about what beer is made from, how to taste it. Then we'll get into our comparisons for round one and see what our preference is. So whenever we go to pour a beer, always what we want to do is start with a nice clean glass. And then you hold the glass at a 45-degree angle. Now, the one thing I'm going to point out is that we don't need to fill the glass all the way full because we're about to do a tasting and that involves some swirling. So don't fill it to the top because you might spill. So I'm only going to fill mine about halfway full, but we want to pour it down the side of a 45-degree angle. And then as you get about halfway for the amount that you want to fill, then you start straightening up the glass and create a nice little bit of head of foam on top there too. So normally we would fill the glass all the way up, but because we know we're about to do a tasting, we won't. So go ahead and, start enjoying this beer, smell it, taste it. I'll talk you through how to do all of that like a pro in a few moments. But we're just going to start by talking about what flavors we might even find in beer. And the way that we do that is by talking through beer's ingredients. And I think the reason I like to start with this is because unlike most fermented alcoholic beverages like wine or cider, their origins are pretty obvious. Most people know that wine comes from grapes and cider comes from apples. But with beer, a lot of people don't know what it actually comes from. So we're going to talk about what beer is made from, and then also the tweaks that we use in the brewing process to make non-alcoholic beers, and then get into how to taste it. Won't take too long. So we're going to stick to wine and cider for just a moment, because that will help us find out what we need to make any sort of fermented alcoholic beverage. So with wine and with cider, both fruits, the apples and the grapes and the apples, respectively, are pressed, producing a juice, and that juice is then fermented by yeast. So to make any sort of fermented alcoholic beverage, we need three key things. We always need some sugar, we need yeast to ferment that sugar, and then we need a liquid environment for the reaction to happen in. So conveniently, with grapes and with apples, inside they've got juice, they've got the sugar and the liquid, and on the outside is a natural habitat for yeast. So simply just by pressing these fruits, we can make wine and cider, these two fermented alcoholic beverages. So those single ingredients have everything we need. Beer is not so simple. There is no one single fruit or vegetable that we can press and ferment to make beer. We need to bring in each of those components individually when we're making beer. So beer is typically made with 4 different ingredients, which together give it this amazing range of colors and flavors and styles. So while it's a little confusing at first to get started getting to know these 4 ingredients, by having these 4 ingredients and by tweaking them slightly, we can create over 100 different beer styles, and more of those are becoming available in non-alcoholic versions as well. So those 4 ingredients that we're going to get to know today are malt, water, yeast, and hops, and I'll talk us through each one, not only what they do in the brewing process, but the potential flavors that they can introduce as well. So our first ingredient is our sugar source. We need sugar for yeast to ferment, and that is our malt. And malt is just shorthand for malted barley. So I'm going to show you what that looks like. This is my handy little photo I show off all the time. So we can see here, we've got this huge range of colors that will come from our malt, and also different flavors that will come from our malt. And that's because in order to make malt, we take barley from the field and we put it through a special process in order to make its sugars accessible during the brew. And the last step of that process is applying heat to dry and then toast the grains. So just think of it like a piece of bread. We can either have the dough before we bake it, then we could have white bread, we could have toasted bread, or we could have burnt toast. So we've got that full range of different colors and therefore different flavors that malt can bring into the beer as well. So we can range from gold to amber to black overall in terms of the different colors of beer, and all of that will be coming from our malt. So our first round of beers are largely all gold, our second round are a little bit more amber or copper in color, and a black colored beer would be something like a stout. So we don't have any of those today, but they are definitely out there as options as well. The next ingredient to consider is water, and water is really important for beer. An average pint of beer is over 95% on the minerals that it's introducing, but that's very chemistry heavy, not something we need to go into, but just important to note that water is a big part of any beer that we are drinking. Our third ingredient is yeast, and this is the agent of fermentation. So without yeast, we wouldn't have beer. Yeast is responsible for taking those available sugars that have come from our malt and fermenting them into alcohol and carbon dioxide. We've got 3 different types of yeast that we can use in brewing. The first is ale yeast, then we've got lager yeast, and we can do mixed fermentation as well. So all the beers we're drinking today are ales. Ale yeast tends to ferment a little bit faster, so it's a warmer fermentation. It takes about 3 to 5 days. And in addition to producing the fruit, in addition to producing the booze and the bubbles, it will also produce some fruity flavors and some spicy flavors. Lager yeast functions at cooler temperatures, so it will be a slightly longer and slower fermentation, and it will really just produce the alcohol and the carbon dioxide. No additional fruit or spice in a lager. Hence why you may hear lagers described as cleaner than ales. They don't have any additional fermentation flavors. The last one is called mixed fermentation, and we don't have any of these today, as I've said, but you can get some mixed fermentation alcohol-free beers, some really good examples out there. And in this one, we use a mix of yeast plus bacteria, and the bacteria will produce some acidity to make the beer taste slightly sour. So it's very tart and refreshing, and it's a really unique flavor that most people don't expect beer to have, but this is indeed a unique type of beer where we bring in extra fermentation agents in addition to just using brewer's yeast. So lots of different options.
Nat, sorry to interrupt. Just a quick
go ahead.
question from the non-alcoholic viewpoint, which is there are different ways of making non-alcoholic beer. Sometimes you brew a full strength and take them out. These are much more brewed to strength, and they use special yeasts. I know some kind of use like a wine yeast, etc. Is there something you can tell us about that, or am I putting you on the spot?
Yeah, so this is really interesting. Well, I'll jump to this bit now, talking about how we make different types of non-alcoholic beers. But as you've mentioned, we can take 3 different approaches. We either make a full strength beer and remove the alcohol. We do a sort of lazy or slow fermentation. So we take a yeast strain that's not very good at turning sugar into alcohol, therefore less alcohol will be produced. Or we don't do any fermentation at all. And that's a possibility as well. So for the first ones, when we brew a regular strength beer and remove the alcohol, the 2 main approaches there are called vacuum distillation or reverse osmosis. Vacuum distillation involves applying some heat. So we're essentially cooking off the alcohol so it gets removed from the beer. And that's how then we reduce the alcohol content overall. but some people say it can add a slightly cooked flavor to the beer, so that's maybe why we wouldn't want to do it. Reverse osmosis doesn't involve any heat, so it won't change the flavor of the beer at all, but it's very, very expensive. This is what you use to purify water in water treatment. So only very big breweries or breweries with deep pockets are able to go for something like that as their way to remove the alcohol. Many breweries, as you mentioned, the ones that we're tasting today, they will use this special type of yeast. And the thing I wanted to say is that they're all very proprietary and they're very secretive about their yeast strains. So that's why I can't really share all that much. You'll see on the can of the Mikkeller beer, the Weird Weather, that it says made with Mikkellensis yeast. So they use their own special strain of yeast to do this sort of slower fermentation where just less alcohol is being produced overall. They'll also make changes to the malt. So they'll make malt choices that have larger starches that yeast can't ferment. Again, that's another reason. So we've got this lazy yeast and we've got a not very fermentable beer to begin with. So less alcohol will be produced overall. So they can make all these little tweaks during the brewing process to make it less fermentable and use this special yeast strain. So it is possible they're going to produce some other fruity or spicy more to the beer. That's always sort of the thing I dislike about the last option, the no fermentation. Fermentation, yes, it produces alcohol, but it also produces some interesting flavors to our beer. And without any fermentation, we miss out on some of those flavors sometimes. So I tend to think of the beers that aren't fermented at all as having more of like an infusion. They're more like a tea because we've got the malt giving its flavor, the hops giving its flavor, and the water there, but there's no yeast at all in there, so no alcohol will be produced at all. And some people do want to opt for that. They don't like the fact that the alcohol has been produced and removed. They'd rather have no alcohol produced at all. So many different ways to make non-alcoholic beers, and therefore many different flavors possible in these non-alcoholic beers as well. And I'll just wrap up with the fourth ingredient in beer because it's important to our beers today, and that is our hops. If you haven't seen what hops look like, here's another little handy photo. They're these beautiful green cones, and they will bring bitterness, aroma, and flavor to our beers. And most of the beers we're drinking today are IPAs or slightly more hop-forward beers, and these beer styles are defined by their hop choices. And what's interesting about hops is where they grow influences the flavors that they bring to the beer. So all hops will contribute some amount of bitterness, but the aroma and the flavor that they bring in is different based on whether they're American hops, German hops, British hops, etc. So most of the beers we have today will have American hops. Some will have some European hops as well, and we'll talk a bit about how that changes their flavors soon too. So just to recap, malt is our sugar source. That then provides the sugar that's fermented by yeast into alcohol and carbon dioxide, which we can choose to remove in alcohol-free beers. Then we add our hops to bring bitterness, to balance out sweetness, and then we've got water, which is that liquid environment for the overall fermentation. So they all play their part, and yes, it's much more complex than just saying grapes or apples in terms of what beer is made from, but this is where we get so much different variety in terms of colors, flavors, and styles for beer. So let's talk about how to taste a beer then. Tasting beer like a pro. So you've got your beer in your glass, we're ready to go. In a beer tasting like a pro, it's actually a 4-step process, and we don't get to tasting until step 3. So we've got 2 things to do first. So first off, what we want to do is just look at our beer. The first step of the beer tasting process is simply to assess our beer's appearance. Oh, look at that. Tim, you are a pro. Just holding it up to the light, looking right through it. Perfect. So that's what we want to do. So the reason we look at our beer is because its appearance can tell us a few things about what we might expect in terms of the flavors and the textures when we get on to tasting it. So when we look at a beer that's gold in color, we might then expect, as I've said with that analogy with bread dough all the way to burnt toast, we're looking for flavors that taste more like white bread or water biscuit in a golden colored beer. In an amber or copper colored beer, so the beer's in round 2, that's where we'd expect to find some flavors of toast or caramel. And then in the darkest beers, the stouts, the brown or black beers, that's where we might look for things like coffee or chocolate. So just by looking at our beer, we know right away what sorts of flavors we might find coming in from the malt. Also, whether we can see through our beer or not will tell us a bit about the textures. So if we can't see through it, so in our Weird Weather beer, which is a New England IPA, that's slightly hazy. And that means we're going to expect a fuller body and a creamier texture from those beers. Another example that you may have seen is something like German wheat beer. Those ones tend to be quite hazy and they tend to be a little bit fuller and heavier on the palate. If it's bright or clear and we can see right through it, we'll expect a slightly lighter body in those beers. So again, I say we want to look at it so we can set expectations for the flavors that we'll find. The next thing to do is define what flavor actually is. And I only learned this relatively recently in my studies, and I think it's so fascinating. Flavor is actually a combination of smell plus taste. So we only have 5 basic tastes. We can pick up on thousands of different aromas. So it's the combination of aroma plus taste that creates flavor. So that's why tasting is step 3. Step 2 is to smell our beer. And we're going to get loads of information about the flavor of the beer simply by smelling it. So for step 2, to assess our beer's aroma, this is why I suggested don't fill it too full. I'm notoriously bad at swirling and I spill my beer all over the place. But I want you to give your glass a swirl. What this does is it brings the bubbles up and out of the beer, and they bring the aroma molecules with them. So I'm going to swirl safely on my desk. There we go. So you can see that rise in the bubbles that have come up and out, bringing the aroma with them. So bring it to your nose and take a short sniff. I don't know if anyone's brave enough yet to say what you're smelling. Feel free to unmute yourself or write in the chat if you would like to. But this is how we get started. We want to smell beer. And there we can start thinking about what are the words that we can use to describe the things that we're picking up. It is very difficult. The brain is not wired to take these signals that we're smelling and turn them into vocabulary. So don't worry if you're struggling. Another tip is maybe the beer is quite cold. If you just took it out of the fridge, you can cup the glass in your hands and warm it slightly. And that helps for more of the aroma to come out as well. And we'll talk about the aroma in this beer in a moment, but I'll get through all the steps first. So the next step finally is to taste the beer. And in this case, again, we're looking for those 5 basic tastes that I've mentioned. And our 5 basic tastes as humans are sweetness, sourness, saltiness, bitterness, and umami or savory. So go ahead and take a sip of the beer. We've got taste receptors all across the tongue. So what you want to do is just give the liquid a slight swish while it's in your mouth, and then be sure to swallow because flavor perception continues after swallowing, especially for bitterness. And we've got a lot of bitterness in our beers tonight. So for most beers, we're looking for some level of sweetness and some level of bitterness. And the different beer styles will vary based on whether it's tilted towards bitterness, tilted towards sweetness, or even in the middle. We do tend to pick up sweetness first. Bitterness can take up to 1 minute to build. So just keep that in mind. You may think, oh, that's a bit sweet initially. And then you'll start picking up on this bitterness and it dries out a little bit. That's just our receptors slowly picking up on that bitterness. And a fun fact, if you want to get even more aroma out of your beer, what we can do is actually assess the aroma again after we've swallowed the beer. So normally breathing in is just called orthonasal breathing. If we breathe back out after we swallow the beer, that's called retronasal breathing. And we can pick up on more. And we've got enzymes in our saliva that will help to break down these different aroma compounds. So it's like patting your head and rubbing your tummy. You got to think about it all in one go. Take a sip, give the liquid a slight swish, keep your mouth closed, and breathe back out through your nose after you've swallowed, and see if you pick up on more aroma that way. I definitely get a bit more fruit that time around. I don't know if that's helped anybody detect a nice fruity characteristic in the beer. The last thing to think about is just the texture of the beer or the mouthfeel of the beer. So this is things like the body. So what I mean by body is it thin like water or full like milk? So how heavy does it sit on the tongue? Many non-alcoholic beers will be lighter in body because alcohol contributes body to beer. So by removing that alcohol, we'll have less overall. Other things we could think about is the carbonation. Do you feel any prickliness coming from the carbonation? Another thing we include here is alcohol warmth, but we're definitely not going to have that in any of the beers today. Alcohol warmth is present in beer 7% and above. So those are the 4 steps that we need to do and that we'll use for all of our beers today to taste them like a pro. So just get it into your glass, have a look at it and start thinking, okay, what flavors and textures might I find based on what I'm seeing here? Give it a swirl and give it a smell. Then move on to the tasting and do that retronasal breathing as well. Breathe back out afterwards. And then think about the texture of the beer too. So I will talk us through a tasting of this beer and then get your perspective as well. And then we'll start doing the comparison to the 2 other beers in round 1 and pick a favorite. And another thing I'll say, I already see in the chat some suggestions of different fruits, like, oh, is this what I'm finding? Is this what you're finding? We do all have different levels of flavor perception. We've all got different taste buds as well. So while there will be certain compounds in here that we know, okay, we could describe this as this fruit or this as this, We do all have different ways of picking up and processing these different compounds in terms of language. So feel free to say whatever words are coming to your mind, because so much of it is tied to memory. So it could be that you've eaten a sweet that tastes like this, or you smelled a perfume that smelled like this. And all of those different ways of language will help us process what we're finding in the beer. And it takes a lot of practice, so just get comfortable, have some fun with it. There are no wrong answers here. And I will say as well, before we get to the vote, we still got a few beers to taste. We're not picking out the best beer in terms of technical flaws or brewing precision. It's about what you enjoy best. So what has the right balance between sweetness and bitterness? What flavors do you like the most? So just keep that in mind. It's not like we're trying to champion the best beer of the world here. We're just allowing you to find what flavors you enjoy the most out of all these different alcohol-free beers that are available. But I know that there is a little bit of a competition across the pond. So we'll see how we do. So let's talk through a tasting of this beer here. So this is, again, the Athletic beer. This is the Upside Dawn, and they've advertised it as a golden ale. And that has a lot to do with its color. It's got this beautiful gold color. And also, there's no technical style from America that's called a golden ale, but this would be very similar to a style that's called a blonde ale in America, and that just, again, implies the lighter color. And a blonde ale is sort of seen as like a gateway craft beer. So normally we've got our lagers, which is where most people start. They're very accessible, pretty light in flavor. And then we've got the American Pale Ale, which is a big jump up. It's going to have a lot more bitterness, a lot more caramel flavor, a lot more hop presence. And for some people, that jump is too big. So this is the beer that sits in the middle, this golden ale style, that will have a little bit of hop character, a little bit of nice fruity yeast character, but it's not too intense in terms of bitterness or overall flavor. So it allows you to step up from the lager to the pale ale. So with this one in particular, again, we've commented on its beautiful golden color and a slight haze, but we wouldn't say it's impossible to see through. In terms of the aromas and flavors here, definitely I saw some comments in the chat, and I'll get the full chat open, but lots of a little bit of a tropical fruit character. So fruity notes are definitely present there. And then a light floral note as well. I don't know if anyone's picking up anything slightly floral or a little bit grassy too. And that grassiness can come from certain hops and the way that we use them in the brewing process. And then I also get a little bit of an underlying grainy sweetness. So that nice sort of freshly baked bread kind of sweet grainy character underneath. Then when we go to taste it, initially, as I've said about how the tongue works and what we're picking up, there is a bit of a sweetness there, and that comes from the malt. But then we get this increase in bitterness to really dry out the finish. And what I mean by that in terms of dryness is there's no sweetness left on the palate. So we almost feel like the moisture is being removed from our mouths. And that comes from the hops bringing the bitterness that helps to dry out the finish. So that means it's really refreshing and quite crisp in the finish as well. And it makes you want to go back in for more because there's no lingering sweetness there. And again, we pick up on those same sorts of things, the fruity characteristics and the nice grainy sweetness underneath. In terms of the mouthfeel, that last step, it's relatively light. Again, really nice summer beer, easy drinking, light in body, and then it has that dry finish from the bitterness. So I'm quite enjoying this one, but we haven't had any competition for it yet. Anyone else want to share what they thought of this beer? Any tasting notes, any preferences? Feel free to do it via the chat, or you can unmute yourselves and say as well. You can keep your video off too if you would prefer. What have we got in the chat? Peach, pineapple, yeah, very nice. Not much bitterness on this one. Exactly, Tim. So in the next round, we'll definitely get more bitterness in some of those beers. But that kind of dries out the finish of the beer. Not too prickly or fizzy. Some fruit. It's delicious, a tasting note. I love that. That's great. Any other comments on this one? Adam, what are your tasting notes? What do you think of this one overall?
Yeah, I got pineapple, but then salt and umami was mentioned, and I totally got that once it was prompted. And I think it's that dryness that you're describing at the end. Yeah, there isn't that lingering sweetness, which I think we will get with a couple of the others. And it's worth. I mean, some people rave about this. It's really important to them. This is something that's 14 calories. And the sugar is like 1.4 grams per 100 mils. So it's pretty low. You don't get many non-alcoholic beers that are as low as that. So I think pound for pound, it's got a great amount of taste, and it is also gluten-free and vegan, which is
so it really
pretty
ticks
impressive.
all the boxes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I quite like this one. I think we're in a good place to start, but shall we get ready for the comparison?
Mm.
So the next beer that I suggest that we try is the Coast IPA. And the reason we're doing this one first is because it's 0.0, and then we'll do the Weird Weather, which I believe is 0.3. So get your second glass so we can taste them all side by side and go back and forth and see what we prefer. So go ahead and pour some Coast IPA into your glass. And then Adam, if you want to tell us a bit more about this brewery.
Yeah, so Coast is founded by a guy called James Brown, who is actually the co-founder of Beer 52. So if anybody's a full-strength beer drinker, Beer 52, big beer subscription business, one of the co-founders, well, actually the founder, James Brown, founded Coast as well. This beer is brewed in De Proef brewery in Belgium, even though it's kind of a Scottish brewery, which is the same as the Mikkeller that we'll be coming on to taste later. It's also made using the lazy yeast method, but most of those beers out of that brewery at 0.3%, and this somehow is 0.0%. But it does pack quite a lot in terms of the sugar and the calories. I think it's 33 calories per 100 mils, and it's well over 3 grams. I think it's 3.8 grams. 3.8 grams of sugar per 100 mils as well. So it's quite, you wouldn't call it a low calorie, low sugar drink, but it is 0.0, which is great. It's also worth saying is this isn't I would say their top beer. They have some double dry hop beers, which I personally absolutely love, but I thought it wouldn't be as quite a good a comparison for this test. So we've selected their standard IPA.
Perfect introduction. And that's interesting. You say that it's actually fermented, because I thought it might not have been, because most beers that are 0.0 have not had any fermentation. So yeah, they must have just gotten it really low. And I think that's where the sweetness is coming from. A lot of the sugars are remaining in the beer because they haven't been fermented. So with this one, significantly lighter in color than the first beer. So we've got almost a deep gold in beer number 1, and then we've got this sort of lovely straw, or I don't know, a pale yellow in beer number 2. So a lot lighter in color, a little bit hazier in appearance as well. So give it a swirl, give it a smell, see what you're picking up. I get a very distinct note here on the nose of a certain fruit or sweet. I don't know if anyone else might be picking it up as well. So I'll pop some things in the chat before I plant ideas in your brain. I see one suggestion. Any other takers to put theirs down? So the first suggestion from Rebecca is pear. And yes, pear or banana tend to be quite common descriptors for this particular aroma. And pear drop sweets might be another thing that is a memory trigger out, or even those banana foam sweets as well. Could also be described slightly as bubblegummy. So we've got a lot of a fruity banana bubblegum note on the nose. And what's interesting about this is actually these aromas are really common in a German wheat beer. So aromas like this are found in certain beer styles. They wouldn't normally be found in an IPA though, traditionally. So this to me doesn't necessarily match up with a traditional description of an IPA, but it's got these really interesting fruity, sweet aromas and flavors that I think if you're a sweet tooth like I am, it can actually turn out to be quite pleasant. So let's go ahead and taste the beer and see the sweetness bitterness balance that we've got. So for me on this one, I don't really get much bitterness. And the way that we can tell that is we get the sweetness initially, and you still salivate a little bit if there's still sugar left over. Whereas when we've got the dryness, you feel like that moisture has been removed. So I'm salivating a little residual sweetness here, and I can also taste that sweetness too. But I think it complements those fruity flavors nicely. So while I don't really think it is matching what I would expect from an IPA necessarily all that well, because that's a style defined by bitterness and by hop aroma and flavor, this is still a really pleasant, fruit-forward, nice and sweet, easy drinking, low alcohol beer. Thoughts on this one? Any other words or descriptors to add, or preferences between this beer and the last beer? Feel free to share via the chat or over audio too. and also have a go returning to the first beer and see if you can pick out any new flavors around this. I'm going to go back to the first beer quickly. This is what we do in beer school. We've got all the beers in front of us and kind of say, okay, now taste this one, compare it to this one. What differences can we pick out? For me personally, the bitterness of the first beer then becomes a lot more evident in the finish compared to then the sweetness that we find in the second beer. And bitterness is an acquired taste. A lot of people initially, when they first get into beer and they are, given a pale ale or given an IPA, it's like, oh, whoa, 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 what is this? If you're a coffee drinker or you're a tea drinker, you may be used to that bitterness, but if you don't drink those things, most other beverages are quite sweet. So it can take a little while. We can, of course, acquire the taste for bitterness. Yes, people love their IPAs, but initially it may be a bit much. So going for something like beer number 2 could be a better place to start. You get used to those fermentation flavors, the lovely flavors from the malt, but there's not that overwhelming bitterness that there can be in some beers. All right, are we ready for beer number 3 of round 1? So get that last glass out. The last one to taste in this comparison is the Weird Weather from Mikkeller. And this one is a low alcohol New England IPA style, so a variation of the IPA, and we'll talk about what that means in a little bit as well. Adam, you can tell us a bit more about this beer.
Yeah, so this is this brewery is it's actually a Danish brewery, founded by a guy called Mikkeller, and it's also brewed in Belgium, De Proef Brewery. They don't have their own physical brewery, Mikkeller, and I think it's just one of those non-alcoholic beers that is, I always call it the daddy of non-alcoholic beers. It's some something that just defies science or logic, in that a lot of the beers, Upside Dawn not so much, but a lot of the beers that have less sugar, less calories in them, maybe are gluten-free and vegan, and those types of things don't necessarily come with as much flavor or as much balance. And this is one, Mikkeller also do one called Henry and His Science, which is lovely, but it has like 100 calories in it. It's insane how much calories. And this packs for me so much flavor, and yet is only 13 calories per 100 mils. Actually, it's a different brew. The previous brew was 12 calories per 100 mil and 0.1 grams of residual sugar in it per, so it's just a really, really healthy drink to have and packs a load of flavor. So I slightly cheated. I thought having a NEPA in there alongside a golden ale, but I just really wanted to get it in the box.
And it is a very good point. So yeah, New England IPA and that sort of golden ale style, they are slightly different. This is something that Adam and I mentioned briefly as well when we were talking before we got started. There's a lot of blurring the lines in beer styles in regular full strength beers, and even more so in the non-alcoholic beers, because when we were, the flavors will change slightly, and so therefore it's harder to box things into certain styles. But I think from what a New England IPA should taste like, creating a non-alcoholic version or a low alcohol version of it, this is incredibly impressive. So the difference between a traditional IPA and a New England IPA, which you may also hear called a hazy IPA, is, well, it's hazy, so we can't see through it. So this is more similar in color to the second beer, a little bit darker, but it's got more of a haze to it. And that comes from the addition of a certain process for adding hops called dry hopping. So we get a lot of hop aroma and flavor, but a little bit less hop bitterness in this style. So it should be really intense in terms of some nice tropical fruit notes. Perhaps, I think peach for me was the main thing when I was smelling this initially that I really picked up. So lots of hop aroma and flavor, as I've said, but when we go to taste it, we shouldn't actually taste too much bitterness. And to help it have that hazy appearance, we use additional grains, not just the malted barley. We'll also add in to the haze, and they give this really nice softness to the texture of the beer. One of my favorite descriptors is pillowy for the mouthfeel that we would expect in a beer like this. So go ahead and smell it, taste it, and share your thoughts on this one in the chat. So what I think about this one is it's quite a nice balance actually between the first two beers. So the second beer, we had a lot of the sweetness there. In this third beer, we have the sweetness, yes, and we've got that lovely, juicy, tropical fruit hop profile, but then we've got enough bitterness to balance it out. So it's not tilting towards the bitterness. It's not as dry as the first beer. We've still got that little bit of lingering salivation, but it sits nicely right in the middle where we've got enough hop bitterness for balance, but lots of hop aroma and flavor. And that's what we would expect from a traditional New England IPA. So as I've said, this is a very good low alcohol version. Not loving this one, Rebecca. Is there a certain aroma that you're finding that you... Oh, then we've got the opposite from Helen. This one's Helen's favorite. This is what I love about beer. There's a beer out there for everybody, and everyone's preferences are different. Any other takers to share what you're smelling or tasting in this one?
Does anyone else get like a bit of an off scent from it? Like a gone off sour kind of a scent?
Can you, I guess it's difficult. I'm wondering if you could put it into any more words than...
Like a rotten fruit, that kind of sweet and sour.
So on my description of this, I did write overripe. Very common. So yeah, very good nose for certain types of hops. When we use them in dry hopping, we kind of, we get the fruit where it's at the point where it's almost about to go off. It kind of smells so intense and fruit character. You're like, uh-oh, is something happening in the fruit basket? But yes, it's just this really intense concentration of hop aroma and flavor that comes from the dry hopping that also contributes to the haze of the beer. So yes, a little bit of that in there. I think for some people, they perceive it as a pleasant tropical, and maybe for you, you've had some bad experiences with, old fruit baskets. So it's not coming back as a pleasant aroma. But yeah, if you do drink more hazy IPAs or New England IPAs, that sort of intense tropical fruit or overripe fruit is quite common. So maybe avoid those and go for the more traditional IPAs if you're not enjoying those particular aromas. But yeah, very good nose.
Katie, I think we might need to get you doing our tasting notes.
Yeah.
You've got a very sensitive smell of aroma. Brilliant.
Yeah, very impressive. Okay, so Rebecca's getting more of that unpleasant sort of overripe fruit characteristic as well. Okay, is it time to take a vote then for round one?
Yes, so voting, because there's only a few of us and other people are joining, what we'll do is just put it in the chat, if that's okay, and I'll tally it up.
All right, I need to make up my mind. I'm tied between 1 and 3 because they're so different. And there are things I like about both of them, but I'm not sure which one's my favorite. And again, it's just whichever one you enjoy the most out of all of our options.
I'm going to stick my neck out. I'm going to go for the Mikkeller Weird Weather. I think I probably know.
I already said that earlier. You were going to go for that.
I was going to say, I did, but it's hard to get away from. I think it's just got better balance. For me, the Upside Dawn just doesn't quite have enough bitterness or enough kind of sweetness. It's sort of halfway between the two. Okay, so we've got 4 votes for Weird Weather so far. 1 for Coast. Yeah. Now you better vote for Athletic.
I'm repping the States. I'm giving Athletic a point. Yeah. I just enjoy the dryness of that finish. It makes me want to go back for more quickly than when I'm drinking the Weird Weather. But the Weird Weather is very tasty as well.
Well, I think that is unanimous then. Sorry.
All right, so if you'd like, go ahead and refresh your glasses and grab the next 3 beers. And then we don't need to go through the whole spiel again. We just get right into the tasting of the next 3 beers and start doing our comparison. Yep, so the Run Wild is up first. So again, starting with Athletic like we did in round 1, and then we'll do the next 2 beers after that. So we've got the Run Wild IPA. Adam, any notes on this one you want to share?
I didn't select this in the same sense as I selected the others. They were just
these are the only 2.
Self-selecting. It is worth saying actually, Athletic have a huge range of beers. The one that I think is the best, Free Wave, is not yet here in the UK, but it's going to be coming at the back end of the year. So it's going to be, hopefully fun to see this one. Cool. Okay.
And so this and all the beers that we're tasting today in round 2 are all defined as IPAs as well, but we can tell just by the color once we get through them and the aromas and flavors as well, that they fit the more traditional definition of an IPA, which you may also hear called a West Coast IPA these days, as it originated on the West Coast of the States, in California in particular. So I've mentioned a few of these things already, but really what we're looking for in terms of an IPA is a lot of hop presence. So we want hop aroma, hop flavor, hop bitterness, and then also usually a little bit more malt presence as well. So you'll see all of these are a little darker in color. We've got more of an amber to copper color. So they'll usually include a type of malt called crystal or caramel malt. That gives a slightly darker color and a little bit of a caramelly sweetness to the beer as well. So I see everyone looking at the beers, swirling, tasting. So any takers before me to share some tasting notes? I don't always have to go first, so feel free to say what you're finding in this one.
I get a load of pepper in this. I don't know if people are getting pepper.
Ah, interesting. Any other takers? So I do get some of those more traditional hop characteristics that we would expect in a beer like this. And I think it does go along with your pepper description, Adam. These characteristics are often described as like pine or resin. And so resin is like the sap on a tree and it's that stickiness. But sometimes when you inhale really deeply, you do get that almost like a spice coming from the inside of the hop cone. So that's really what I'm picking up on. So like no tropical fruit here compared to the previous beers. So we can use the other beers as a bit of a comparison. So lots of that pine and that resin, and that comes from our hops. But that was the next thing to know, as Tim put in the chat, a lot of caramel here as well, coming from that caramelized malt. And it's kind of for me like a burnt sugar characteristic as well. So we've got that pine, that resin, that burnt sugar. I find it quite pleasant. I'm really enjoying the aroma of this one, but it is very different than the beer we had in round one. So no tropical fruits or banana, pear, that sort of characteristic. And then going on to tasting it, anyone want to comment on the balance between sweetness and bitterness here? Now, this surprised me. I'm not getting as much bitterness as I would expect from the beer. So in the golden ale, I definitely felt that nice dry, bitter finish. I think because we know that that caramel malt that's making it a little darker, making it taste like caramel, that brings some sweetness too. So I find there's a lot more sweetness in the balance here. And so there is some bitterness, but I'm not picking up as much as I would expect for an IPA. And I do think the next two beers, as I've already tasted them, will get a little bit more bitter. So I'm expecting a little bit more bitterness in those ones compared to this. So if you're like, what is a lot of bitterness? I don't know. The next two beers should have a little bit more bitterness for a good point of comparison. But it's light in body. It's pretty smooth overall. It's really easy drinking. But I think I would just prefer a little bit more bitterness in the beer.
That's really interesting. I'm getting a lot more bitterness from this than I got from the Upside Down. Yeah.
How interesting.
I don't know who's getting more bitterness from this and who got more from the Upside Down.
Any takers? I do. You know what's funny? I don't actually really like bitterness that much. I tend to avoid very bitter beers, but I'm just not getting that much bitterness on this one. But yeah, maybe it's me. Anyone else finding this one more bitter than the previous one from Athletic? It looks like Tim is typing. Maybe we'll get some answers from him in the chat. Okay, interesting. So a little bit more for Rebecca on this one. And then Tim says, I get bitterness, but then it quickly goes, unlike some other beers. But Helen's the same as me. The Upside Down is a bit more bitter. How interesting that we all just have such different taste perceptions.
I was going to say, it's also worth noting.
Comments to share or thoughts to share on this one? Sorry, go ahead, Adam.
I was going to say, it's just also worth noting, this one's 19 calories per 100 ml and 1.2 grams of sugar. So this one classes as low sugar and low calorie and is quite a bit less than the other two. So
the other two in this round that it's being compared to. Ah, interesting. Okay. All right, so let's try the second beer in this round then. That's the Jopen, if I'm saying it correctly, non-IPA at 0.3. I'm still tasting this against the Upside Down, trying to make all my different comparisons. It's funny, actually, going back to the Upside Down now, I do still taste a lot of bitterness in it, but it has brought out more bitterness in the Run Wild. All right, so get your smelling and tasting going for the Jopen non-IPA, and feel free to share some comments on that one.
I think I'm getting bubblegum from this one, like the Coast one.
I thought that too. And I thought, did I use the same glass when I did my tasting previously? Did I leave some behind of the other beer? Yeah, it's that same sort of pear, banana, bubblegum aroma on this one too. Yeah, I do find it a bit strange. It's definitely not something that we would often expect in an IPA. We want more of the hop fruity characteristics as opposed to these sorts of characteristics, which would usually come from the yeast. So again, it could be that they're using maybe a similar yeast strain that is one of those lazy yeasts, and it's just producing these other interesting esters, which are certain compounds from yeast that give a fruity characteristic.
I'm pretty sure this is also brewed in the same brewery in Belgium. So the Mikkeller used their own yeast called Mikkellen's yeast, and they were the first to kind of develop it. All the other beers that come out of that brewery don't use Mikkellen's yeast. I don't know if they've got their own proprietary one or they just use a de Proof yeast, but it's also 0.3%, so it has been brewed using a different technique, but it may use the same yeast.
Yeah, so definitely some of those same sort of fruity characteristics on the nose, banana, pear, bubblegum. More bitterness on the palate for me for this one. So while it doesn't necessarily smell like I might expect an IPA to smell, it tastes a bit more like an IPA in terms of that bitter hit and that much drier finish. It's got the color looking really nice as well. But again, I find kind of like with the Coast beer, those aromas aren't necessarily what I would expect in an IPA. So it's a bit off-putting from what I'm expecting for that style. But again, some people love those flavors, so maybe this might be your favorite. Any other comments or thoughts on this one? I like yours, Adam. You can do some contributions either on the chat, some contributions over video with us. Yeah, it's interesting. It's the last one for me, the Vandestreek, that has a lot of orange. Actually, that's where I get the orange characteristic. And yeah, Helen, that's an interesting point about it being slightly syrupy. I think, as I mentioned, those crystal or caramel malts that are often used to give the color, they add a little bit more body to the beer too, and that maybe can give it that sort of more syrupy sort of feel. All right, and if you're ready for the last one, we've got the Vandestreek Playground as our final contender in this round. And this is a 0.5%. Well, I suppose it says less than 0.5%, so I don't know exactly how much is in there. And I know Adam has a particular fondness for this one. The first time he and I had a call, he was like, have you not tried this yet? This one's amazing. So yes, when did you discover this?
Well, I mean, I have, there's bias throughout this. There is no objectivity whatsoever, because this beer is the beer that launched Sober Sauce. Without this beer, we may not have started. I found it, I was going to a party in Rotterdam, and I wasn't drinking. I didn't drink at the time. And I went to the corner shop, just picked up something, and I saw they had some non-alc beers, and obviously it's an amazing label, isn't it? So I was like, I'll have a bit of that. Bought 4 of them, and I was just wowed. And that is what started my interest in non-alcoholic beer, and thinking, are there any more like this? Can I find it? And also then we run a competition every year called the AF Cup. So I could play on words with the FA Cup, football themed. Sorry, it's 1 minute to go. And yeah, so that is, it started sober source. So this is still my favorite, still my go-to, but I'll let you decide.
So we're putting it to the test. Exactly. So yeah, this one, you mentioned oranges on the previous one. I definitely get, I mean, this is me getting too fancy with my descriptors, but I initially smelled a candied orange peel when I first smelled this one. So the orange, like marmalade, you kind of almost smell like the pith of the orange. So we know we're getting a bit of the white along with the orange rind. And then like that burnt or caramelized sugar is in there too. It reminds me of those desserts, like a dessert that might have a candied orange peel on it and a nice caramelly sweetness to it. I'm liking everything about the aroma of this beer. So I don't know how other people feel, but this one, when I first smelled it, I was like, wow, there's a lot going on here. Orange, maybe a bit of grapefruit, that burnt or caramelized sugar, the pithy kind of characteristic, marmalade. I'm enjoying this one. Anything I missed from anyone else? Any other descriptors you've used or that have come to mind? And then moving on to taste this one. Again, it's that caramelly malt sweetness initially, and then the bitterness kind of builds up quite slowly for this one. And then for me, I think it just tilts over to the bitterness in terms of the overall balance of the beer. It's got a little bit more body to it than some of the other beers as well, so it sits a little bit heavier on the palate. But yeah, I'm really enjoying this one. So I think I've probably revealed my vote a little bit too early, but others, what are your preferences? What are your thoughts on this one? All right, so Tim says, this is one I have drank a lot of. Great taste and a lovely level of bitterness. Ah, interesting. Rebecca said a chocolatey smell initially.
Yeah, I get that. Yeah. Yeah,
that is interesting. And maybe it is from the slightly darker malts that are used here that we can get that sort of caramel characteristic. Yeah. And I've not tried that stout before, but it sounds like the bonfire stout is one to try to pick out the similarities with this one too.
Yeah.
All right, so any last thoughts, questions to share about this round, or shall we go to the vote? I think we're ready to vote. So go ahead and same as last time, pop your vote in the chat. Adam will take notes and tally it all up once everybody else has gone through their box. My vote is for beer number 3.
Vandestreek, and mine as well.
And another from Katie. Helen was for the Run Wild.
Tim, Playground. Rebecca. 5-1.
All right, that one's definitely got a bit more balance in one direction.
Vandestreek has it. I mean, it is a phenomenally good beer. I think it's just the balance. It suits so many occasions for me. And I'm glad it's lived up to. I talk about this so much. I build it up to everybody, and somehow it does seem to live up to that. So yeah, I'm pleased with that.
Nice. Well, yeah. Does anyone else have any questions around the beers more broadly? Any takers with questions or any comments to share around the beers? Any ones that maybe Adam missed out on that could have been included in this box?
Oh, yeah,
nice comparison.
Good question, yeah.
I think an important factor for me is like believability. Like if I can kind of forget that I'm drinking non-alcohol beer, and the Vandestreek really ticks that box for me. I have half a bottle and I think, oh, I'm getting tipsy now. I've had too much because I'm so convinced it's a regular beer.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point because I almost feel it as well. I was going back to taste something else again and was like, have I had too much? And then I'm like, oh wait, none of these have any alcohol. Yeah, so that's a very good point. The fact that you just don't think about the fact that it's slightly different than a normal version of an IPA. Yeah, the psychology behind it's really interesting.